Hi everyone, welcome to this video where we'll talk about the Brexit a little bit. I'll look at answering your questions. Some of the questions this week, you mostly seemed interested in sort of the campaign, the media campaign before the referendum, which we should definitely talk about. The reading actually was quite a wide-ranging account of, certainly talked about the media campaign. But it also sort of broke down the electorate, who voted for Brexit, who voted against Brexit. So wasn't as much theory in this one as there has been in some of the other stuff. So that's interesting. Anyway, I'll look at this first question, the most popular question. Thank you, Shannon Hood. The failure on the part of successive governments to challenge Eurosceptic assertions laid the basis. The failure on the part of successive governments to challenge Eurosceptic assertions laid the basis for the arguments successfully deployed by the Leave campaign. It allowed Eurosceptic press free rein to criticise the EU at every opportunity, and it deprived the Remain camp of the opportunity to make positive case for membership, forcing it to rely on warnings about the cost of Brexit rather than explanations of the benefit of membership. I really disagree with that quote, by the way, for reasons that will probably come up. Question, it seems that perception played a major role in the Brexit referendum. How do we responsibly stop misleading information from taking hold of public perception? In some ways, that's a very difficult question to answer, particularly for me. I think there's a class that we do here at ASU that looks into sort of social media, fake news class that one of my colleagues teaches, which you might well be interested in that. Maybe in that class, maybe you would get into some more better answers for this. But let me give you a go, and let me step back a few paces, right, to somewhere that I feel a little bit more comfortable, right, which is this the idea of referendums themselves. Should we let the people decide, right? Should people in popular referendums get to decide this sort of policy? Right? That's oftentimes the question around having a referendum in the first place. And people that say no, we shouldn't have a referendum. Sometimes the argument goes along this line, right? That, well, can we really? People can be misled, and it seems, at least from from people who say let's not have referendums because we can't really trust the people to decide, right? There seems to be an idea that, well, some people are more easily misled than others, right? In this narrative, there's always somebody doing the misleading, in this case, the media, right, the press, and somebody being misled, and the people who are misled are oftentimes, the common people. And this is a common, prevalent attitude throughout, for hundreds of years about democracy generally, right? Sometimes when we talk about democracy these days, we're thinking more about sort of liberalism, liberal democracy, where representative democracy, where you choose representatives, you have elections. The democratic part of it is every 4 or 5 years, depending on which country you're in. You get to vote, but otherwise, you don't play a full formal role in politics beyond that, oftentimes, right? And then oftentimes, it gets sort of mixed in with things like freedom of the press. Democracy means individual liberty, freedom of the press, which of course is much more liberalism than democracy. But referenda, right, that they are really a democratic instrument, right? It's a device whereby we're not voting for representatives and then allowing them to conduct our business for us. We're actually conducting our own business. Now, of course, this is where we get into the sorts of questions about, are we fit, right? Are we fit to conduct our own business? Do we know what we want, or can we be easily misled? Perception plays a role, right? And there is, and this is making me think of Edmund Burke now, right? Edmund Burke, when he gets elected to Parliament, he tells the people of Bristol, he says, look, you've elected me. not to be your delegate, not to go along to Parliament and say the things that you would say. Quite frankly, I'll do a better job of representing your interests than you will do yourself. Right? And so this is an argument from Edmund Burke. This is a prevalent argument that's been, and it gets into that in the reading a little bit about why did he have a referendum, right? It was a big gamble, right? He was gambling. I think early on in the reading, the authors talk about, well, you know, he gambled on this position where he was going to go to Brussels, get a better deal for Britain, and then come back and have a referendum, showing everybody, look at this great deal that we have from the EU. But they say that breaks down. One of the reasons it breaks down is because the authors say, look, the press went, the media, the campaign, the Remain campaign ended up talking about the dangers of leaving rather than the benefits of staying. Right? People don't respond to that. Is the implication? And then one of the other reasons, right, is this, right, that we were misled. People were misled by, I suppose, the Leave campaign, but via the media. One of the reasons why I am not 100% on board with this quote or with this reading is that it talks about those big parts of the media that were very much on the Remain side. A lot of the campaign from the Remain side of the media was very sort of frightening, right? Was, as they say, you know, focus on the costs of leaving, right, with an attempt to really scare people, right? And so I think when it comes to this, my answer, right, in terms of public perception, of course, both sides of any kind of political debate, and particularly in a referendum where we're making a particular policy decision, both sides are going to come in and they're going to try and sway the public, right? And this is what they taught me when I was, I suppose, a long time ago, right? That, you know, this is one of the, I think it goes back probably to John Stuart Mill, right? One of the beauties of liberalism, right? The beauties of being able to sort of allowing everybody to speak, right, and everybody to say whatever they want. One of the benefits of that, says John Stuart Mill, is that, you know, we get all these competing arguments and stories, and we get to judge between them. But because we get a whole bunch of different arguments, you know, if we're getting lied to, we're also getting the truth, right? Because if somebody's saying one thing, somebody else is saying the opposite, and so at some point we're getting all the good information as well, along with all the bad information, and we get to decide what makes best sense to us, right? And that we're rational beings who can decide between alternatives, and we can understand what's in it for us. Now, that's liberalism. Of course, in Marxism, you have this idea of a false consciousness, right, which would apply here to referendums where we think that one thing is in our interest, right? We become, they had this other name for it when I was at school, embourgeoisement, which is an awesome word. I mean, it's a French word, right? But it just means that we think of ourselves as bourgeois, right? We think, again, with Marxism, but we think of ourselves as a sort of middle class, what we call in Britain middle class. The United States middle class means oftentimes something different, but you know, we think of ourselves as capitalists, right? We think of ourselves as well off. We have this false consciousness, and so the things that seem to be that we think are in our interests are not really in our interests, right? We've been blinded by our education, right, and perhaps by the media and that sort of thing, right? And so that's not a liberal thought. Like, you know, again, liberal thought makes us rational and able and self-interested and competitive, but able to choose what's best for ourselves. And so interesting. It's in that way, right? Thinking about it in that way, it makes us think, okay, this is sort of a Marxist argument here, right? About false consciousness. We've been led to believe that something's in our interest that's not really in our interest. And so we could come up very easily with a Marxist response to that, right? A Marxist answer to this. in terms of how do we responsibly stop misleading information from taking hold of public perception, right? It's well, this is a big problem in Marxism, right? Because you've got to be able to be outside of it yourself, first of all, right? You've got to know. And so Lenin, for example, who embellishes a little bit Marx, who adds extra onto Marx, Lenin comes along and says, oh, we need a vanguard party, a group of people, a small cadre of people who are wise enough, intelligent enough, and who are awakened, right? Who are freed from this false consciousness, who have a proper class consciousness, that understand the real interests of the working class, and then they take control of the government by probably violent revolution, and then they educate everybody else. This is what you're really interested in. This is really to your benefit, right? But of course, that leads to all sorts of other problems, right? And so I like the way that you've put on your question, responsibly stop, right? Because maybe a Marxist revolution is, maybe some people think that's a responsible thing to do. Certainly millions of people in the world have thought that was a responsible thing to do. But whether you and I think it's a responsible thing to do is it's a question that we probably won't answer here. But how do we responsibly stop misleading information from taking hold of public perception? Right. Good question there, and certainly very, very relevant. Certainly a deep part of the narrative surrounding the Brexit referendum, and most referendums as well. Most referendums. Let's see if I can get to the next question, because I've pressed a strange button that's taken me into quite a nice screen that gives me a clear view of the question. But all right, here we go. I could have just done that as well. Another one about the press here. Let's see if it leads us somewhere slightly different. I got very ideological there with liberalism and Marxism, and didn't really offer any explanation as to how we might stop that the misleading of people. I guess other than sort of fall back on this J.S. Mill idea that if we let everybody say their piece and then trust people to judge, they'll judge correctly. That's as I said, a very liberal way to look at it. The British press had maintained a largely supportive tone towards European integration up until the 1980s, when the position shifted towards destructive dissent and scaremongering became commonplace. The author mentions how, over time, the dependency on the media limited individuals' critical thinking skills when it came to international policies like Brexit. How does increasing individuals' unawareness benefit state cohesion? What are the potential red flags that come from a population that blindly supports the media and the state? Everything that I said for the last question, I think applies to this question too. Helps and informs an answer to this question. Further, what I would say in this one, and maybe just emphasize something that I said on the last one, is like, look, in liberal democracies like Britain, right, like the United States, like France, and many other countries, you usually have a pluralistic media, right? You'll have, in the United States, we have CNN and we have Fox News, right? And the people that like one usually don't like the other. And then I've mentioned those two, but there's so many others as well, right? There's I'm going to try and name a few more, but there's more sort of less mainstream, even less mainstream. I mean, Cox, I guess, Cox is cable, but that's not what I want to say. Fox is cable, right? Fox is cable news. Well, CNN's also cable news, but you also have networks that have their news. You have internet news sources. You've got things like RT, Russia Today. You've got Al Jazeera. You can get Democracy Now. Sort of small independent ones, and obviously in the case of Russia Today and Al Jazeera, foreign-owned, foreign government-sponsored. You can get the BBC, which is in the same category as the Chinese one as well, was it CCTV. You've got a multiplicity of news sources, and they each do have, if you look at, Al Jazeera, they have a different interest and a different editorial position than Fox News does, which has a different one from CNN, which has a different one from ABC, right, which has a different one from the BBC, right? But they all do have some sort of and so I think certainly in taking this to the British press, which is what the quote is about, if we take this to the British press, you do find something like a newspaper like The Sun, which is the best-selling newspaper. It's a tabloid. It's less well respected by professional types, right? But it's very widely read by sort of more working class people, right? So yes, they have the most popular newspaper has has been Eurosceptic. But if you look at the other end of the spectrum, something like the Guardian newspaper, right? That's also part of the British press. Absolutely a part of the British press. It's a broadsheet, which means it's actually means it just has on bigger paper, right? But the broadsheets usually have the reputation, correctly so, probably for using slightly longer words, right, and saying things in a much more respectable way, and speaking to a different audience, right, a more middle class professional audience. And the Guardian is read, for example, by social workers, teachers, university lecturers, that sort of those sorts of professional, educated, middle class people, right? Whereas the Sun might be more working class, blue collar type people. But again, sells many more copies than the Guardian. So we have this. So when we said the British press has done this, or the British press has done this other thing, certainly the Guardian and the Sun have not done the same thing. Right? The Guardian has been fairly supportive of European integration, quite supportive of European integration. The Times, which is maybe slightly to the right of the Guardian, still sort of professional, but maybe working in different industries, maybe working in banking and that sort of thing. Maybe more private sector managers and that sort of thing. They're reading the Times. They're probably fairly supportive of European integration as well. So, yeah, when we talk about the press, it's always very difficult to talk about them in generality. Again, it's not that there's not a multiplicity of views on European integration, and the reading does go into that, right, and talks about how there's been a division in the country for a long time on this. But how do you make policy in a democracy? This really goes down to this sort of level of theory where how do you make policy in a democracy where people are not going to share the same views, and how do you deal with it when your side loses, right? And that's again, we're getting into a little bit of comparative politics here, right? But when one of the arguments about Britain, for example, which is less true in other countries like the United States, but one of the arguments about Britain traditionally, and this is becoming less true even in Britain, traditionally it's fairly homogenous society, right? And so they say, look, democracies can work quite well in homogenous societies because whichever side loses, right, you're not losing to people, homogenous in all sorts of ways, homogenous in values, right, in demographic, level of education and that sort of thing, right? So it has traditionally been fairly homogenous society, and so the differences between the people, right, between the political parties are fairly narrow, and they're not on really fundamental things. Right? But membership in the European Union seemed quite fundamental to a lot of people, and probably is one of the most fundamental differences in the United Kingdom, right? So you've got now this great. All of a sudden, where you're used to a politics where, if the other side wins, yeah, sure, like there'll be some different policies than what you would want, but you can accept it because it's not that different anyway, right? Because you most people are fairly on the same page anyway. But when things start to get more important or more, being in the European Union seems to many people to be a very different thing to being outside of the European Union. Right, spending 5 billion extra on the NHS or 7 billion on the NHS, that is different, but it doesn't seem as fundamentally different, right, than if we're inside the European Union or not inside the European Union. So this is another, as democracies have to cope more with these very, very fundamental differences, it becomes much more difficult to do that, and you have to have, or Um, so one of the differences between the British system and the American system is this, that the American system is set up to acknowledge and recognize that there are not minorities, either states, different states, north and south, northern states and southern states, or even racial minorities, significant ones that have in the past differed fairly sharply on issues. Southern states versus northern states, I think is maybe the best example, right? When they're setting up the Constitution, that was very, very relevant. Maybe small states versus big states as well. In industry versus, there was real fundamental divisions in a very large country across a large space. In Britain, right, we're much closer together, right, and the differences were less fundamental. So you have in Britain a majoritarian system where we say, let the majority rule because, hey, it won't be that different anyway, to the United States system where we say, no, we really seriously need to protect the rights of the minorities. And so we have the Bill of Rights, we have a court, a Supreme Court, we have a Senate and a House that have the same power, right? If we look at Britain, we'll find very different setup because of those reasons, right? And that's a bit of comparative politics, but it takes us to the question: how does increasing individuals' unawareness benefit state cohesion? This state cohesion could be thought of in terms of this homogeneity or this this general agreement, right, on the facts. And I think this is one where I don't know how this is increasing unawareness benefits state cohesion. I don't know if I can speak precisely to that, but I can certainly say that this is a relevant question, right? And I can certainly say that there's some sort of an incohesion when it comes to the question of Brexit. And I think, again, right, we've talked about this, and I'll just sort of state this and finish it. I think it would be difficult to say that, look, that the population is blindly supporting the media, because, like we said, there's different voices in the media. And so, although now that I say that out loud, now I start to sort of see, well, you could all be supporting blindly supporting a different news, right? We could be blindly supporting the Guardian or the Times or the Sun, or the Daily Mirror, but we'd be led in different ways, right? And that might cause incohesion. Nice. All right, I'm going to try this last question now and end. The media found it more worthwhile to pour a stream of anti-EU invective into the resulting vacuum rather than critically engaging with the issue, let alone highlight the benefits of membership. Being that the media reaches the masses, do you believe if the media took a more unbiased approach, the Brexit could have seen a different outcome? I think, again, in comparative politics, there's two models. There might be more by now, but it's been a while since I've really looked too closely into comparative politics. No, it hasn't been that long. I taught a class anyway, a couple of years ago. But I don't think we covered this. There's two basic models of media. One is the model that I think we have in the United Kingdom, and I think it's a similar one here in the United States, as far as I can tell. And that's, you have this multiple different media sources. They all have an editorial, right? They all have, well, and also you sort of state both sides, right? You state both sides of the story. This is what these people say, and this is what these people say. Even perhaps within one media source, even within one story, right? That's the idea. This is what they say. This is what they say, and we leave the reader then to sort of figure it out for themselves. Right? Who shall I believe? All right, and there might be more. Some news sources might want to push us more one way than the other by presenting one of the arguments in a slightly better way or a slightly more compelling way. That certainly happens, but the overall model is, this is what these people say, this is what these people say about the event that happened. In the Nordic countries in Scandinavia, there's the alternative model. And the alternative model is to try and find the real truth, right? The real sort of the facts, right? The real facts in the case, right? Which is a different, which sometimes sometimes it sort of leads us to believe, okay, we're not looking at this side and this side, we're looking at somewhere in between these sides, right? And so the journalists are trying to find that in between spot, which, as far as I can tell, is no more closer to the truth than what we're doing, right? But it's a style, right? It's a style of journalism that we talk about, at least in comparative politics. I'm not a journalism expert by any means. So, so this unbiased approach, right? Perhaps look at both of those models, and is one of them more unbiased than the other? I think I already said one of them is not more close to the truth than the other, but that's my opinion. But is one more unbiased, which is a slightly different thing than the other? Is it more unbiased to present both sides of the story, or is it more unbiased to find the middle ground between the two? And that's sort of the way that journalism tries to, across different democracies, across different countries, tries to reach that unbiasedness. But of course, let's see. I'm going to do one more, I think, because we've talked a lot about the media, and it's been kind of interesting. I think, this is not really a comparative politics class, but I think the questions really sort of took us in that direction. I think also the reading took us in that direction, because the reading is kind of a comparative politics reading, which is interesting and good to look at. Comparative politics is sort of the study of different governments, the study of different means of governance, like referenda, and sort of how they work in different countries. And so oftentimes in comparative politics, oftentimes we're comparing groups of countries to each other. Sometimes we're just looking at one particular case, which is what this reading was doing, looking at the case of Brexit in Britain, and trying to answer questions about how the political system or political tools used to resolve problems, how they functioned, and what results came from them. So, comparative politics. All right, let's see this one now. Oh dear. Let's see if I can. This is the next most popular question. Thank you, Bianca Rodriguez. The Leave campaign, meanwhile, maintained the momentum it had begun to pick up in April. Boris Johnson proved the star of the show, capitalising on his personal popularity and touring the country tirelessly. The Remain camp was simply unable to put anyone to match his public appeal. The former London mayor's closing words in the final debate made a massive impact, as he asserted that 23rd of June could be the UK's Independence Day. Would the Remain or Leave voting process have been different if it were further influenced in the Brexit decision-making? Had one party fulfilled its role in performing increased analysis and strict campaigning to further levy the points of view represented? Let me just... So would the Remain or Leave voting process have been different if it were further influenced in the Brexit decision-making? Had one party fulfilled its role in performing increased analysis and strict campaigning to further levy the points of view presented? I see this as one of the interesting things about the Brexit referendum was that it was parties were free and parties did split. Right? This wasn't one party goes one way, another party goes another way. Major politicians in both parties were on the Remain side. Boris Johnson, who's mentioned in this question, was probably the major politician on the Leave side. You'll have heard of Nigel Farage as well, who was until Brexit a fairly marginal character in British politics, but not completely an unknown name by any stretch of the imagination. And so I look at this as sort of the role of parties, and it's interesting when it comes to a referendum, because of course parties are usually set to function in a representative democracy. they make it easier for us to vote for candidates to represent us because they provide a shorthand way of figuring out which candidate's going to vote in which way, what his policies and attitudes are going to be, what their stances are going to be on major issues. We kind of have a shorthand way in parties of knowing that parties perform other functions as well. Once we elect our representatives, and parties help them to cohere and to agree and to work together on their platform that they campaigned on, and provide all sorts of other offices and that sort of thing, and research and that sort of thing. But in a referendum, it's usually, it's always, right, about a particular policy, a particular issue, which, parties might have a stance on that particular issue. But the interesting thing is, in Britain, when we have referendums, we're having referendums almost always on issues that cut through party lines. If it's if it had been clear the Conservative Party are for Remain and the Labour Party are for Leave, then the normal electoral process would have taken care of that, because we'd say, well, who won the election? Did the Conservatives win or did the Labour Party win? And if the Conservatives win, then we're going to Remain, and if the Labour Party win, then we're going to Leave, right? And it would be normal politics, normal representative democracy. But when it cuts across those party lines, now it becomes difficult. Now, when I'm voting for a Conservative Party member, is that member of Parliament going to? He maybe is in favour. Like I'm thinking of Jacob Rees-Mogg. He's clearly, and always has been, in favour of leaving the EU. Right? He's been a Eurosceptic. He's in the Conservative Party. And on the other hand, you have Kenneth Clarke, right, who's been in Parliament forever, since I was very, very young, maybe even before I was very young. But he's been in Parliament for a long time, and he's very clearly in favour of European integration. So now I know I'm going to vote, let's say if I'm in Jacob Rees-Mogg's constituency, and I want to vote for I want to vote for Jacob Rees-Mogg because I'm Eurosceptic. Well, I'm voting for him. He's going to Parliament, and now the Conservative Party have a majority, and now Ken Clarke, back in the 90s, Ken Clarke is the Chancellor of the Exchequer. So I'm voting for a Eurosceptic, but in government, I'm helping a Europhile, right? Somebody that loves Europe, into government. So it's when it gets messy like that. Now this is when Britain uses referendums to sort out those sorts of messes. And we focus on the Conservative Party because they were in power at the time that the referendum was called, and they're still in power now. But if we could say the same thing about the Labour Party, right? There's absolutely people within the Labour Party, many people. Well, Jeremy Corbyn, the leader of the Labour Party at the time, has always spoken out against European integration. People on his wing, the left of the Labour Party, have traditionally been against European integration. And it's people more on the right of the Labour Party, sort of centre-left politicians, who've been in favour of further European integration. So because of that, that's when you get the referendum. And so I think in answer to the question, had one party fulfilled its role in performing increased analysis and strict campaigning, it was very difficult for parties, especially I think the Conservative Party recently. In the 80s, the 70s and 80s, this was a big issue for the Labour Party. The Labour Party split apart, and that's where the Liberal Democrats come from, by the way, this real split in the Labour Party. And it was mostly about economic issues, but the European Union was part of those economic issues that they split. The Conservative Party has been riven with division over Europe for as long as I've been alive. And so this was a way to... So the parties, the single parties themselves, could not really deal with this because they were so split. And it was in part to sort of save the Conservative Party. I think that David Cameron called the referendum and said, look, we can't go on like this. It's tearing us apart. Maybe there would be an actual physical split, which would, just sort of split the centre-right vote in the United Kingdom and leave the Conservative Party outside of government for a long time, not just, and probably whatever other party would come out of the Conservative Party. as it did with the Labour Party in the 80s. So, and most of the 90s until 97. So, so very difficult for a party to fulfill its role in performing increased analysis because they're split. Boris Johnson, I like this quote as well because it sort of touts the role and the political power, I suppose, of individuals in politics and in referendum. Certainly, it talks about Boris Johnson, who comes out obviously very, very strong and ends up as the Prime Minister as a direct result of his position and his abilities during the campaign. He becomes Prime Minister, really forging a coalition in the country unlike any that we've seen for 100 years or more. Literally, like he was winning seats as a Conservative, not him personally, but his colleagues, his Conservative colleagues, were winning seats in the northeast of England that have been Labour Party since Labour Party began for over 100 years. This is incredible, right? But it's a result of this realignment after the Brexit campaign. So, and Boris Johnson, the other person, Nigel Farage, his profile went up through the roof. They're trying to get him in the House of Lords. He's refusing, right? Because he's a bit of a rebel, right? And rebels don't go to the House of Lords, because then you've got to behave yourself. So, yeah, good question, good quote. I'm going to end this now. I could probably talk all day, every day about Brexit and still not have said everything that I have to say, but certainly I hope that this was helpful. I hope it's pointed you in the direction, probably away from our reading actually, but into some directions of comparative politics, sort of electoral systems, demographics and electoral systems and democracy, media, theories about the media, that sort of thing. So a bit of a mixed bag today, but inspired directly by your questions. So all the best to you, and I hope you're doing well on the midterm. I'm about to grade that. I'm about to start grading it. It finished last night at the time that I'm making this, and so I'll get on to grading that. Give me a week or two, please. There's a lot of you, there's a lot of essays, and I will do my best to get through it as quickly as I can, but I want to be thorough in my grading, so it's going to take me a little bit of time. So, all right, all the best.